Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 318. Have you ever had those tasks or projects at work that seemed really boring or like a complete waste of time? Well, it might just be you don't know enough about why you were asked to do them. That's the problem. Early on in his career as a programmer, Richard Russell was asked to develop some web pages for a particular application, but all he really wanted was more context on the business problem they were trying to solve through doing this work. Unfortunately for Richard, he never got that extra context in that role. Maybe that's why he chose to move on to systems administration as a result. Today, Richard is a business owner focused on coaching leaders across big tech, scale-ups, and other corporate environments. In part one of our discussion with Richard, you're going to hear about his pattern of pursuing topics that are interesting, whether it was in college or in the various job roles he's had from the beginning of his career up until closer to now. We'll follow Richard through his career as a programmer, his job as a systems administrator. We'll talk about his move into consulting and how all those things put together made him the ideal candidate for a team lead or technical lead. Richard also shares some thoughts on building trust and prioritization that I think you'll find really helpful. Here we go with part one of our discussion with Richard Russell. Richard Russell, welcome to Nerd Journey.
Hey, good to see you, Nick. Nice to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. Let's start by having you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do today, please.
You may hear from the accent, I'm Australian. I live in Luxembourg with my family, and I spend most of my time coaching leaders, primarily in scale-ups, some big tech leaders and some sort of more traditional corporate environments. Usually people who've got to some level of executive responsibility, usually from a product or tech background. Sometimes they're, heading into product leadership or tech leadership or CEO, founder type roles. And I coach them primarily remotely on video is how I do things. And it's a relatively recent transition from doing more consulting work.
So much to dig into there, but I want to dial it back to the very beginning, Richard. If I remember reading right on your LinkedIn, you started studying math and computer science in school. What kind of made you want to study those topics?
I grew up in a family where my father's an engineer. And he was always enthusiastic about engineering. He sort of had this belief that engineering is the right career for everybody.
Like mechanical engineering?
Well, he was an electrical engineer.
Electrical, okay.
Like power electrical, that kind of thing, like transformers and stuff. Yeah, I was at high school in the 90s and early 90s. At this point in time, I was very, very good at mathematics and interested in computing. And I'd got a computer early on. It was like I had a Commodore 64. If you in the audience remember them. I had an AT and eventually 386s and all these sorts of things. And I was a bit of a nerd on these computers, and I got into a bit of programming here and there and so on. But basically, I just sort of went through high school and did well in all of the hard sciences, the physics, maths, chemistry, maths 1, maths 2 in what we did. And I had to choose a non-science subject for my final year. And the one I chose was economics because it was the least language rich. And I thought that would be most mathematical, so I'll do that. So I've always had that affinity, and I went into mathematics, computer science. In fact, I started out doing engineering, partly influenced by my dad, and had a bit of chopping and changing through university. But then mathematics, computer science, I even did a bit of theology, did a bit of philosophy and cognitive science, and other things like that. And so swapped and changed around quite a lot. But basically it was because I found those subjects really interesting. And when it comes down to mathematics, even there's like applied mathematics, which is like solving differential equations and stuff, really boring. And then I found it interesting when physics teachers and engineering lecturers taught mathematics, because I found the actual application, the practical part, I had the need to solve a problem. So I was like, and that's interesting now. But the funny thing was that, and then I ended up finding pure mathematics much more interesting. So I went into pure mathematics and studied like fractals and all this stuff. And we had this saying, like a toast, here's to pure mathematics, and may it never be of any use to anyone, because it was all about the things that are interesting. So I ended up sort of moving from purely being interested in the science, in the physics or general science, to just mathematics. And computer science was the application part that I liked, but it wasn't that mathematical really. So it's kind of a long-winded answer there, but yeah, that's where I came from. But basically because of my talent in mathematics.
I remember hearing physics majors in school say that they learned more math in the physics courses through that application and the teaching of it that way than they did even in their calculus courses, for example.
Oh yeah, because I found that the calculus courses, it was all like, here's a really complicated problem, but it wasn't applied to anything. So I had no idea what I was solving. It's just like, here is an equation. What if we want to differentiate it? Or here's an equation. What if we want to integrate it? Or whatever we're doing. And, Fourier transforms and things like that. Whereas with engineering and science and physics, it was more about like, we have this field and we want to know how much energy is going through the field. Here's a thing which is a Fourier transform, and here's a thing which is a surface integral or whatever it was. And I'd sort of learned this by the practical need. Because I had the interest in the practical need, that was fine, right, and I could learn that. And in the pure mathematics, I had the interest in just like learning stuff. So it didn't really matter what it was. I was interested in fractals and like, whatever it was that we were doing, group theory and all sorts of things that I've forgotten now.
This is really interesting because what you're talking about is starting off wanting to understand the application of the mathematics and then getting really interested in the abstract concepts of mathematics. And I actually think that might mirror some of your story here. Was that the same way you learned programming? Like, was it the application of it was what you needed to learn first, and then you started focusing on the theories and higher level concepts? Or was it approached differently?
Even with the maths and computing and things like that and the physics, I actually think that I get interested in topics, but I don't find complicated mathematics interesting, as in the complications of integrals and so on. I didn't find anything fundamentally interesting about that. Whereas when you're playing with numbers or playing with groups or whatever you're doing in pure mathematics, or when you're looking at physics and you're looking at like, fields and forces and circuit diagrams, there's something interesting about them. So I just wasn't interested in the complications of applied mathematics. When I went down the computer science, when I was interested in computer science, I think it was mostly how do these things work and what's going on. And someone was a very early interest. Like, it seems like a thing that I can control, I can influence, and I can build a thing that does something. And it's like, I was never very good at art. So, but then on a computer, I could draw these, I could draw a 3-dimensional cube on the screen and stuff like that. And it was amazing. So I found that sort of side of it interesting as a toy in a sense, and learning how to control things that didn't require manual dexterity or artistic talent. So that was one part of it. I think I got very interested in the theory behind it as well. Like I got quite theoretical in some parts of it, but then my interest moved on to businesses and how products are built. Without knowing about product management, I was very much in like, what kind of thing can we build and what will be useful? I really wanted to build games, but I just did not have any particular skill in those areas. And the mathematics behind, especially graphics, was very complex. And it was exactly the stuff I didn't like doing. Whereas the business games and business side of applications or programs or websites and so on, they're quite simple in many ways. The complexity is really about like, what do I actually want to achieve, as opposed to how do I achieve it? And so that became much more interesting to me. So a lot of that is related to my interest in product management as I went on further and in business generally. I have this habit of like obsessing over topics, whatever they are, whatever I'm interested in. So I go deep in whatever topic it is.
So when you're obsessed with programming, computer science, and then it becomes your job, does that increase the obsession with the topic, make it harder to stay obsessed because it's now a job and it's work? How do you think about that philosophically?
I think there's a very practical part to this question, which is that I've I'm 48 now, and in the last year, I diagnosed as ADHD. I discovered that I have ADHD, which is quite common amongst software developing kind of people and science type people and business type people. And so when I look back at my time there, there's this dissonance between what I philosophically what I believe is good or right, or the right way of doing things, and what actually happens to my brain. So I tend to just find things interesting and obsess over them. When it's work, it's not necessarily interesting inherently. It could be, it might not be. The decision on whether it's interesting or not is independent of whether it's work. So when I started doing work, there was things that I found interesting. And what I tended to find interesting all the way through that career from the early days, I was doing some software development and so on. I have to say the product I was doing was so boring, just so dull. It was like an administrative tool. But this is my first job. I'm really frustrated because I realized that there were 6 users of it, this product. And it was a significant product for the department I was in. It was useful, but there were 6 users.
So like an internal facing application only?
Internal facing administration tool to track the number of park benches in national parks, right? Things like that. It was like a national park company and where all these assets are, asset tracking for national parks. Useful tool, right? It had some value, I presume.
Sure.
I remember thinking, what am I building? And all I'd get was this user story, and I'd have to build a piece of web page or whatever it was that I was doing. I think it was early web stuff. It was just like mid-90s, maybe early 2000s. So I was building this thing, and it's like, I remember thinking, why are we doing this? And what problem are we actually trying to solve? And why haven't I met any of these people who are using this thing? Why don't I understand what they're trying to do? Like, is this even the good way of doing it? It's just like we're taking an old database system and turning it into a web application because that's the thing you do. The whole thing, it was fundamentally, like, on a deep level boring because I wasn't talking to the people who were having their problem. So I didn't know what we were solving. I didn't know why we were doing it. I was just producing web pages. So then I shifted from there to sysadmin because sysadmin was more like, here's a problem, solve it quick, right? So then I'd know I'd have a person who had a problem. So I can solve that. So now that's interesting.
And you could go talk to them about it, right?
In some ways, sometimes talk to them. Sometimes it's just a matter of, I know when the system's down or when like it's going too slow. I mean, I understand that problem because I've been there. So I know there's 35 users who are all complaining about this, and I know who's upset about this. I don't necessarily need to even talk to them about it, but I can feel the problem and I know what it is. And so my motivation ended up being very much about someone has a problem, I can come in and solve it, and I can help you now. And then, hey, I've done it, it's fixed. And then I got a pat on the head,
Yeah.
Whatever it is, right? And the other part of this was we need to do a software update, like a patch. We did a lot of patching of servers, Solaris servers at the time. We do these patches and so on, and it's kind of like there's a problem, there's a risk out there, and then you'd go and do some work, and then it's fixed. Whereas the software development that I was doing, at least, was very much like we'd work for weeks and months and so on, and eventually someone would do a release somewhere along the line. This was way before continuous integration. And so we'd get this sort of thing done, and it would just take ages for it to go anywhere, and I'd never find out what happened or whether it was any value to anyone.
Speaking of that, not finding out whether it was valuable, it sounds like you did get to scratch that itch when you became a systems administrator because you could see the impact of your work and that it changed people's work environment for the better, improved it in some way. When you had all those thoughts about the programming you were doing, the development you were doing, and this doesn't seem to be making an impact, there aren't that many users, did you express that to your team members and your management at the time, or was it just more like an internal discussion that didn't become external?
It was pretty much internal because I didn't realize that, at least in that environment, it wasn't obvious that developers would have any interest in the business or anything else. It's something that I think culturally has changed a lot over the last 25, 30 years or whatever it's been, and more forward-thinking environments that people are in. But at the time, it was pretty much like all you were supposed to worry about was wasn't even a user story. It was like, here's a spec, go and build it. Have you built the spec? The tester would test it, and you'd be like, okay, I've got a thing. I don't know what any of these fields are or why they're there. It's a text field and it goes over there, and then now it's in the place in the database that it's supposed to be in. So yeah, it just wasn't really a thing. I don't think. I wasn't aware of what was frustrating me. It's very much a retrospective view.
It was there, and you didn't realize that it was frustrating. Okay.
Yeah.
There's an interesting shift there because I think there are a lot of people perhaps listening who maybe they started off as programmers, developers. They want to shift into a more systems administration focus. And some people want to go the other way. So we've kind of talked to both sides of that. Were there any innate challenges going from the development side to the systems side that you remember and would kind of caution our listeners against if they want to make that shift?
My advice for someone looking to do that now is well dated because it's 30 years ago. The thing is, at the time, I'd spent a lot of time with using Linux. I ran a Linux install fest. We had like 200 people coming in installing Linux on their computers. And in my early university days, I tried to start a startup, which is like pre-cloud stuff, all about remote administration, like systematic remote administration of hundreds of Linux servers. So you'd have hundreds of servers. And this is back when Debian was, I don't know how well people know Linux these days. It was using Debian and packages and so on, and like configuring them remotely from a database so you could have all these computers self-serve and self-update themselves.
Oh, wow.
I was just playing with these things on my spare time. Like, I was interested in it and seduced by open source software manifestos and things like that. So I had the interest in it, and it was like a hobby, if you like. Going into it from software development, I think if I was there now, it would be different because the software development these days, at least in most places, is much more connected to the business, or it's more possible to do so. So whereas sysadmining, systems administration, is quite removed. And you're providing a service usually to the people who are then providing a service to the people who are then providing a service to customers, right? So you sort of got multiple layers. So in a sense, like the big caution that I'd give someone going into that direction now are two things. Number one, is it even a ongoing concern? These days we have cloud services and multiple layers of things, and we don't have a lot of people who are building computers. I also built computers like for a time, like, getting motherboards and all that sort of stuff. So I do all that sort of nerdy thing, but it's just not done very often these days, and there's not much demand for it. And people have moved up the stack. So they've gone from, back in the day of Apple's founding, people were getting chips and boards and connecting together with wires, and that was hobbyists. And then in my day, it was, building computers and installing drivers and all that sort of stuff, and doing sysadmin was kind of like where it's at. And these days, I don't know whether anyone needs to do that anymore. It's a very niche, it's increasingly a niche area where you can build on so many other things if you want. Now, people still do it. People still do hardware. People still do chip design. I have a friend who's a chip designer, right? It's still done, but it's a very niche, relatively speaking, a niche area. So if as a business, I think about where do I really want to be? And then from my own personal interests, I found it much more motivating to be with people and businesses, influencing people and understanding how and why people buy things and what kinds of things people buy. So that's much more interesting to me now. But back then, I think it was interesting, but I didn't really realize it at the time. So that would be the secondary thing, is that sysadmin type work is very much a service. If you look at any business, sysadmin or anyone doing IT infrastructure, it is a cost center. It will always be a cost center, unless you're in a business where it is the profit center, which is very rare. In most cases, it's a cost center. When you're in a cost center, you're always one of the people who gets secondary importance in the organization, at least at best.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I mean, systems administration could be hardware, it could be software, some hypervisor layer, the virtual machine layer, the operating systems of server type platforms. It could be even the public cloud if I'm using that in my environment. Maybe I'm a systems administrator of like the pipelining tools that the dev team uses, for example. That's what I was thinking.
I'm no longer hands-on with most of these things, so I don't keep up with it as much. Well, I guess the levels of abstraction are sort of continuing to rise, or whatever you want to call it. So as long as you're in a place where there's ongoing demand, ideally you want to be in a growth area. You wouldn't train as a COBOL programmer now, right?
Right.
So you want to be in a growth area where there's ongoing demand, and ideally in a place where there are businesses who make profit from doing what you're doing, as opposed to businesses where it's a cost center.
Yeah. So you get into systems administration from development. It looked like you might have done something you call consulting in that light somewhere. How did that fit into the story?
I can't remember the exact sequence of things, but basically I was a software developer, decided to go into sysadmin work, then decided that I'd go independent, which is kind of freelancing, I think we'd call it now. Basically, I just had a bunch of clients who were small businesses around my hometown, Adelaide, and they had Linux services or servers, or they had server rooms or whatever it was, and they needed someone to update the software and install things and set up print services and all that sort of stuff. So it's fairly standard sysadmin kind of things in those places for individual companies on a day rate or occasionally it was sort of like a project basis. But it was pretty much what I'd call now freelancing in that space.
In the working with multiple companies and sort of freelancing, was the aspect of working with multiple different customers with different environments more interesting to you than working for a company as a sysadmin that has one environment? I mean, certainly there's change, there's different things you can learn, but that's different than, okay, I have to serve these 20 customers, for example.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that are interesting here. One is, again, it's actually a characteristic of ADHD minds, is that you like to have variety. And so I like to have variety. So that's a thing that I like. And I know that not everyone's like this. Like I have plenty of colleagues who like to go deep in one thing and own something for a long term and build it over the long time. My wife is like that, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I quite like that, oh, here's a new thing, let's learn something about that. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that when you're the consultant working with some small businesses, you work as a peer or as an expert working with the people who have the business need. And so the conversations that you have are more interesting in some ways. At least they're more interesting to me, let's say. But as I discovered as I was doing this, that I was able to get more into the business questions and problems that they were having. Like, why do you think you need a print server here? Like, what are you trying to actually do? And realistically, most of the companies, they didn't care about the details. They just wanted to be able to print, right? So we needed to do a thing. And so, okay, then now I can go in and find the needs and then solve the problem with whatever software I thought was the right thing and recommend it to them. So that was in some ways more interesting than working in a larger organization where I was a junior sysadmin in a team of 3 or 4 plus 30 or 40 developers, and you're still removed from those decisions. At that point in time, it becomes much more execution, like here's my tickets, here are my problem tickets. We need to install this server or upgrade that one or whatever it is we're doing. And it becomes tasks and problems, which is more interesting in so many ways than here's a spec that you need to develop over the next couple of weeks, for me, or a couple of months. It's just that change of like, yeah, they're a software development company. This is a real estate company, right? They're just a real estate agency, right? But they need a server and they need a file store and things like that. So then I was just going in these places and discovering new things. And so I found that interesting. And being able to have human relationships was also interesting as well. So not just my colleagues, but having new people who were not experts in my area and then translating their needs into what I thought was the right technology.
So this is fascinating to me because not only does it meet the desire to work with multiple companies, multiple individuals, and keep it dynamic, I actually think this is a mirror of the move from the application of mathematics to the abstract concepts. Because I would say, like, if I'm solving a system problem, that's more the application, and then the abstract concepts are sort of those business challenges and the translation layer back to the other. I think that part is a little bit harder for most people. Were the business conversations and the types of questions you asked, were those things that naturally came to you in these conversations? Like you knew how to do it, or you figured out how to learn that? Because my thinking is,
it's an interesting question.
We can learn how to do discovery of business problems and mapping them to technology solutions. But it's not like a natural thing for a lot of people to know how to ask those questions.
I always had this innate interest in some of these things. Like that's why I studied some psychology and philosophy at university and things like that. And I had an interest in marketing and business and things like that. At the same time, I always had this feeling that they were magical areas that I didn't know about. Like there were huge amounts of expertise that people had. Like because when I did engineering, you kind of develop and mathematics and computer science and physics and all those things. You develop this expertise in that area that's kind of like, I know you're interested in understanding this, but it's going to take you quite a few years just to get to the level where we can talk about things. If you haven't studied physics at university, it's going to take us a while to even have a conversation about some of these things. So there's quite a big gap there.
Yeah.
And I had this impression that a lot of business and marketing and people influencing and all that sort of stuff was this magical secret knowledge, right? At the same time, I had interest in it. Because I was interested, I'd ask questions, but I'd always feel like I'm the amateur in the room and I'm the guy who doesn't know anything, asking questions, and everyone else in the room has done an MBA and they've done a marketing degree and so on, and they've got this body of knowledge that is a mystery to me. So over time, I kept asking questions and learning stuff, and eventually figured out that actually it's not that complicated. It's not that hard. I did learn, I have a voracious appetite for reading books. And so I read books about these things, and I read books about marketing and strategy and influence and psychology and management. I read a lot of management books. So I'd read a lot of things and pick things up there. And it took me a long time to realize that, actually, I do know quite a lot about this stuff now. And I don't need to have the degree in that topic to be something of an expert in some of these topics. But I certainly learned from these books and from other people how better to go about certain types of questions or certain types of things. There's a book called The Mum Test, for example, fantastic book about learning how to understand what problems people really have, right? As opposed to what problems I want to solve.
I feel like you get into a conversation where someone says, I need to do X, Y, Z. And we can go immediately to try to provide a solution, or we can ask a bunch of questions. And sometimes when we ask a question, it might lead to more questions. Do you find that when you start asking these questions of people who want a solution, that they don't actually mind answering all the questions as much as we might think they do?
Oh, absolutely. I can tell you a story about this if I may.
Yeah, that'd be great.
When I was at Deutsche Bank in London, I had moved across from Adelaide. It's my job after I left Adelaide. And I got this job kind of with this team that was developing a piece of software to trade foreign exchange. Now, when I came across there, I had no idea about investment banking or banking generally or finance or anything like this. I thought foreign exchange, I thought the main market for that would be exporters and importers and tourists. And then I was this piece of software that we were using. We ran this piece of software that traded foreign exchange on a early website. It was like one of the earliest web foreign exchange things using traders in banks would use it, right?
Oh, wow.
I remember looking at the logs and saying, hang on a minute, that's 100 million transaction. That's a 200 million transaction. That's a 50 million. And it's just like bam, bam, bam. These transactions going off of like hundreds of millions and, transactions of like changing from US to euro or dot pounds or whatever they're doing. And I did a little bit of analysis and I was like, okay, hang on a minute. Looking at this, the average week we trade, I think it was like 800 billion in a week on our system alone. And I knew we weren't the biggest system. We were one of the biggest ones. We were like top 3 systems. But I'm like, that means that every week at the time, maybe it was more than that. Whatever it was like, that means that every week we trade 2 Australian GDPs. I was like, that's a lot of money. What's going on here? Like, this can't be export. That makes no sense at all. So then I was like, well, what is this all about? And so I talked to my business analyst on the team and just asked him, can you teach me about this stuff? And we had foreign exchange. We had this thing called fixed income and derivatives and so on. And if you remember the financial crisis of the mid-2000s, the credit crunch, there was all these things called mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps and things like that. That's like, this sounds like all magical terms. What are they? And anyway, he just sat down and explained to me who's doing this, why they're doing it, and so on. I remember looking at these things saying, why does anyone want to buy that thing? Like this credit default swap, you're just taking the risk. He says, well, people have a risk appetite. These people want risk because they want the reward. And they're willing to take this kind of risk for that kind of reward. And they're willing to then trade it back again. And the fact that, I thought, well, why do we even do this in the first place? And, what's the value of this? This just seems like fiddling on the edges. By doing this, it means that when companies actually want to have foreign exchange for their imports, exports, tourism, whatever they're doing, or loans for some purpose, you've got all this liquidity and you can go and find the value of what it is. You can get an interest rate. Otherwise, every time someone went for a loan or did a transaction, someone would have to find the right price and then find someone to trade it with, and it would be really hard. But because we trade so much, there's always a price. So you've always got the ability to buy and sell. And it's really interesting the way these things work. So I learned all that from this guy who's a business analyst, and he'd been in banking for 30 years or whatever. And it was really interesting. His approach to this was, he was like, when I asked him, he's like, cool, I get to explain my area. I get to explain what I know.
Okay, so he didn't say, hey, Richard, why do you want to know? You're just a tech guy.
No, this was the complete opposite of my experience in the government department I was in, which is kind of like, just build the software. This is like, oh, cool, I get to talk to you about my thing.
Yep.
Everywhere I went, I'd be asking questions of like, why is that company doing this? Why don't they just build the same thing we're building? Or why do we have these, what we called white label solutions? Or I'd go to the trading floor and be like, what do you guys actually do here all day? Why have you got 9 screens? What's happening? And asking questions about what's there. And most of the time, as long as you're not annoying people and as long as you're not, asking stupid questions, like really dumb questions, people are willing to explain, even when they're pretty dumb questions, people are willing to explain to someone interested,
Yeah. I heard a personal growth teacher talking about something this morning about the key to learning more was asking those questions, but saying, hey, can you explain that to me? I don't have enough information to understand that yet.
I think that's a sensible approach. But I mean, I think also as you grow, as I've grown in my experience and knowing, I've acquired quite a lot of knowledge about various things over the years.
Mm-hmm.
But often those seemingly dumb questions, like one of the worst things you can do is be shy about asking them, because even the simple sort of things like what's going on here? Why are we doing this? Why does anyone want that? There's interesting nuance to them and people can explain it. And often people are too shy about asking questions that sound like that. You never learn and then you never have any idea. And the person on the other end can kind of figure out if you really don't understand it. And what they want is for you to ask the dumb question so that they can go, cool, now I get to explain the basics to you and then you'll understand. And now I've explained it to you, I now trust that you understand it. Now I trust you more because you've asked the question. And so I often find in most of my work these days, asking that question really helps. Sometimes I ask questions that I do know the answer to so that I can get the person to explain it to me in a way that then they believe that I understand. It's quite counterintuitive, but it's like then they trust me.
Did you have to get past, or do most people have to get past their own ego when they ask these questions?
Yes. And especially if you come from where I came from, which being intellectual, academic kind of background, family environment, even the religious environment, that was very much about being right. That was important in our environment and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, big time. The two ways this comes out for me. One is when someone asks me a question and I don't know the answer. Early days, that was quite difficult because it's like, oh gosh, I don't know. I'm supposed to know this. What's happening? And I'd make stuff up or I'd improvise or I'd give an answer. I'd go from first principles and it wouldn't really add a lot of value. Well, I remember being at Google and someone asking me, I was a sales engineer at the time, actually. Someone was asking me like, how does this work? Or whatever the question was, some technical question. And I had no idea about the answer, but I was coached by my own manager. He said, when that happens, here's what to do. Say, at the moment, I don't know, but I'll go and find out and I'll get back to you. And I'm going to make sure that you have the right answer. But there's more to it. Here's the thing. We have other clients who have had pretty similar setups to you in this way with those kinds of things. And we have solved it for them and they've been fine. And what I was doing in that situation as a sales engineer, this is a very simplistic way of explaining it, is first of all, acknowledging that I don't know.
Yep.
But then also building their trust in our organization and my ability to navigate our organization and our ability as an organization to serve people like them, that they will get the result that they want so that then they can unstick their resistance and sign the contract. And so it was a really interesting thing and I realized my job in that role is not necessarily to even answer the questions. It's not to give information, it's to create trust. That's the role that was my role. Some of it was about influencing, getting data and changing things and customizing things, but most of it was about creating trust. Part of that was about learning that I have to create trust in my client in a way that I don't necessarily, when I don't know the answer, is an interesting thing. And learning to do that and even getting over whether I think that sort of, I had a resistance. I have engineering training, scientific training is like, there's a great deal of pride in not knowing and saying you don't know. So very hard to come to terms with, I don't know, but trust me.
Right.
But in a sense, that actually does make a difference and it does help people. And it's not misleading because we will figure it out and we have done it. So that's one thing that happened that I think is relevant to getting over the ego of needing to know. And then the other thing was like asking questions about things. And I remember another situation, this is not that long ago. I was talking to a group of 400 or so leaders from Vodafone and they were all sort of like business leaders and marketing leaders and so on. So I came to this talk and the guy who was introducing me was a CTO or something like that. And he introduced me as one of Europe's leading marketers, just as I walked up on stage. And I'm like, me? A marketer? I don't know anything about marketing, right? How do I do with that? I don't know. And so, but then I realized that actually the stuff I talk about is kind of marketing related and I can deal with it. So then it was like getting over that sense of imposter syndrome there. And it's a slightly different question to like, can I ask the dumb questions? But when you do ask the dumb questions about whatever they are, you're just getting people to talk about stuff that's their expertise so that they need to know and that they can build trust. And I don't have much fear of asking silly questions anymore at all. I used to have a massive fear of it. I think just these various experiences of realizing that most of the things that are going on are not about whether I know or not. It's about, can I figure out the answer or can we find the answer? Can someone find the answer? What do we need in order to move forward in whatever we're doing? And how do we get that thing?
Oh, I like that. And really what you're doing when you tell someone you'll go find the answer and then you go find it is you're developing your reputation that, I can count on Richard or Nick or whoever it is to go find the answer. They're not going to know everything.
Yeah.
And they've told me that. And if they said they knew everything, I probably wouldn't believe them.
Funny enough, also, a lot of these questions, they don't actually need the answer. How does this auction system work, or whatever it was in Google ads? How does this thing work? And I'm like, well, I don't know, but I can find out and get back to you on that. Or can we add this feature, or whatever it was that they wanted? I don't know, but I can get back to you on that. What exactly do you need it for, and how do we understand your needs here? And then we find out they don't actually need it. Or in some cases, you sort of, we'll write that down. I got it written down. And then I come back and say, here are the things that I was going to find out. Do you need them? And not really. They've developed their trust, and that's all they needed.
Oh.
Sometimes the question is a mechanism to find out, can I trust you? Sometimes they're worried about something that they don't actually need to worry about, and they learn something else along the way they don't need to worry about it. A lot of this, this is especially the case with emails. You got these email requests that come in, and sometimes some of them come in and they're urgent from a manager or a director or whatever, and sometimes you ignore them and they go away and it doesn't matter.
Right.
And judging which ones are the right ones to deal with can be hard, but sometimes it's the case. And there's a lot of things that come in that aren't actually important. Sometimes you go through your old email and you go, that's from a week ago. My manager was asking something that seemed important. Do you still need this? No? Okay. I don't need to follow up on it anymore. And I haven't wasted my time doing 3 hours of work for a thing that isn't necessary.
Yeah. And by asking someone if they still need it, you're showing that you care enough and that you remembered and that you were listening to what they had to say.
Yeah. In fact, funny, sometimes these things are still important. Like, yes, it's still important. It's like, okay, cool. I've got these. This is something I learned from my wife. I've got these. These are the 6 things on my plate. I'm currently putting that 7th. I'm not going to get to it until end of the week or till next week or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Is it still important, or is it more important than these things? And they go, actually, no, don't worry about it. You've got those things. Do those things. Those are more important, right? So that conversation and having that active conversation about how important is this is a really useful tool to figure out what the most important thing actually is. And doing that also provokes, because your manager or your directors or stakeholders, customers, whoever, they might have 1,000 requests, but actually they only care about 4 of them, right? Or some of them are much more important than other ones. And they know this, but they haven't figured out that actually we need to prioritize it for you. So you do the prioritization, you come back to them and say, hey, here's what I think the most important things are. Is the thing you're asking me more important than these? Because I can stop doing these things and do that thing.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're also saying as part of this is we should seek to try and prioritize our workload the best we can, but we need input from the people we're working with on that too. And we shouldn't feel ashamed or incapable when we ask for guidance.
What I recommend doing, especially as you get more senior, is literally just maintain your own priority list, whatever you think is right, and use your own judgment on that. You might be wrong. And then share it with your manager or your stakeholders and say, here's my priority list and here's my capacity. I'll draw a line under with where I think I can get done this week or next week or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And those things I'm not going to get done, and have a conversation about it. And it's an opportunity for at least a good manager to then educate you on how to make priority decisions, right? Or for your stakeholders to explain, this is way more important than that because of this customer, because of this whatever it is, this risk or whatever it is that's going on. Or even that conversation of like, really, that's going to take you all day? Why does that take you so long? I had this project that I had once, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. It's going to take me 2 weeks to get to the point where I have a plan. And someone is like, 2 weeks? I think you can do the whole thing in 2 weeks. You don't need 2 weeks to do a plan. How are you going about this? And I hadn't actually thought it through properly. I'd not got it right. So we went through this and figured out, okay, actually that's way easier. So he was coaching me. And in some sense, it's a way where I felt like I probably should have known this, but the fact that he was able to coach me then enabled me to have that skill to get to the level where I should have been, in terms of being able to do this. And this even happened on a large project at Amazon where we had this huge project and we had this team who said, yeah, it's going to be like 6 months of work to do this thing. And then we just said, well, what does that actually involve? Because we need this. And it turns out they're actually trying to solve 4 other problems at the same time. And they're doing a really complicated thing. And they're sort of like using this as an excuse to upgrade their systems. And we're like, all we need is this thing here. And it turns out to be 2 weeks of work, right? And having that conversation and clarifying what the real need is, why it's important, how are you going about doing it? It was a bit of coaching, a bit of context setting, a bit of like just brainstorming together, a bit of collaboration. And hey, presto, 6 months of work turned into 2 weeks. Not just of one person, but of a team of like 4 or 5 engineers.
Oh, wow. Well, speaking of teams of people, one step between the individual contributor and the manager can be team lead or technical lead. And we've seen some people progress in their career by landing there before they go into people management. And it looked like you were a team lead at the bank back in the day. Can you speak to what the team lead role really is and isn't?
So this is in a role where it wasn't exactly a software development team. It was more of a, what we would call now DevOps kind of thing, but it was kind of a mix of DevOps and third level support and systems administration. So there's a blobby sort of area before it got well defined. And so the way this worked is that we had a team of about 6 or 7 of us, and we were all kind of outsourced in this outsourced group that was on site at the bank. And we had very variable levels of skill, I think, and I was one of the more skilled people. I wouldn't claim to be the best, actually. I think there are other people who are better. The reason why I got that role was because the people who are more skilled than me or better than me were, number one, not interested in it. Number two, quite difficult to deal with, like quite hard work people. And demanding and critical of other people when they didn't get it right. And then thirdly, they weren't actually that interested in the business, the customer. And so my counterpart at the bank would say, he told me that actually the reason why they wanted me to be the team lead was because I'm the only one in the group who really cared about business. And asked questions about their business. Everyone else is just doing work, whereas I was interested in understanding it. And so that gave me that connection. And in some sense, this relates back to what is a team lead or what is a manager in many ways.
Yeah.
It's not just about rousing the troops and getting people focused or making them productive or coaching them. That's part of it. It's for the purpose of delivering value to the business or the customer, right? And so to me, the difference between a team lead and a manager is probably more about the formal responsibility of performance reviews and sort of the administrative kind of like people stuff. But the team lead is kind of like that person who's like doing the leading part and getting people in the right direction without necessarily assessing individuals' performance or hiring and firing and doing performance reviews and so on. That was what my role was anyway. I was there because I was the person who they felt like they could trust with the business, and my manager and the manager on my client side felt like the people in the team respected me and got along well, and I was able to actually coach the junior people and get the senior people performing in the right direction. So it was an influencing thing.
So they approached you about taking the role rather than you approaching them, or was it a little bit of both?
I think it kind of happened naturally. Like you're just sort of there with a group of people. There's a dynamic that happens, and that dynamic happened. And then there was a bit of some conversation about making it formalized at some stage, but I never got a raise for it, which is annoying. It was not quite a formal role, but it was a practical role. And my client wanted me to be the main point of contact.
Oh, that's so cool.
But it was, as I say, it was all about like, on the one side, actually caring about the client need, the business, and then being able to influence and coach people in the right direction. But as I say, it had nothing to do with me having the best technical skills. I was good and I was able to teach people and able to coach people, but I wasn't like the best. And it had nothing to do with me being the best technical decision maker, because there was another guy there in particular who I recall who was definitely way better than me. And he was basically creating the better solution. He was architecting this solution to this problem that we were trying to do. And he was way better than me. But the interesting thing was that our interaction was basically I would help him understand the need for simplicity and getting it done quicker, as opposed to engineering the perfect solution, delivering short-term value as opposed to 6 months and then we'll solve all the problems.
And as a team lead, what was your interaction with your manager at the time like? I mean, was it different than when you were an individual contributor? I'm just curious.
The conversation was more about like, how's the team working, what's going on with the individuals, and how do we even making decisions about, hiring and firing and how well people are doing and whether they're the right people to put in front of the client or not, that kind of thing. But then also being the main point of contact for the client on what we're actually trying to achieve and why. So communicating that whole thing backwards and forwards. So to me, the conversations in that role became much more interesting because I'm interested in the business and the people.
Okay. So once you become a team lead or tech lead, we might call it in some places, you have a decision to make as your next step in your career. You can go back to the individual contributor, you can stay team lead, or you can progress to people manager. And it looks like, from what I read, that you decided to become a people manager. Can you speak a little bit to what made you want to do that and how you made that decision?
I mean, my biggest realization at the time was that the people who are really good at the software or the technology, they're getting better. They're better at it than I am, and they're getting better at it faster than I'm getting better at it. Right?
Okay.
So that was a big realization, was that I'm never going to be the leader. I'm never going to be the best here again. relatively speaking to people in my peers, I'm going to continue to fall behind. And the reason for it is because I'm not actually that interested enough to get really good at it, whereas they are.
Since Richard spoke about his progression to team lead in that episode, and this airs not that far from International Women's Day, I would recommend you go back and listen to some very solid advice from some of the ladies who have been guests on Nerd Journey. Episode 279 is an excellent episode featuring Marnie Coffey discussing the role of team lead and how for her it was the hardest leap. And also episode 246 with Dr. Sarisha Kuchimanchi. She talks about being a team lead as a step on the path to becoming a people manager. Excellent advice from those two ladies and well worth your time to go back and listen. There was a lot of humility in that discussion, and it starts with admitting we don't know. For Richard, he had to get used to that. It was something he struggled with at first, and he had to be coached on it. So if you're not someone who's used to saying, hey, I don't know the answer to that, I'm admitting it freely, but I'll go and find it and I can get back to you, that can be learned. That's something that you can practice doing. And it's the same type of humility that it takes to ask those seemingly dumb questions. Hey, why are you doing that? Or why is this thing that way? Or what does that acronym stand for? I don't actually understand. Or how does this work in your business? I also really love that question of, do you still need this? It's great to help you manage priorities, just like Richard talked about. And especially if you were asked to do something at one point and you're going to talk to this person at a later time or follow up with them at a later time, you can ask them if they still need it. It could be that's a way to get the person on the other end to say they don't need it, like Richard talked about. It could also be a way to help them place a priority on it or give you a deadline. Maybe they forgot to give you a deadline of, I need this by, and you forgot to ask for one. So asking if they still need it could be the driver to have that conversation of urgency and deadline. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this discussion with Richard. If you did, could you take the time to rate us 5 stars on the platform of your choice and consider writing a review? That really helps us reach more people out in the community. And if you want to hear more about Richard's progression on to people leadership and his role as a coach, tune in next week.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.